I didn't know a bruise could change a man's life, Jack Morgan said quietly, staring at the trembling waitress in front of him. And in that single moment, the whole room seemed to stop breathing. The restaurant was already fading into the late-night glow of crystal lights and soft jazz. But something about the woman standing near the service counter pulled his attention harder than any deal, any threat, or any power move ever had before. Her name was Emily Carter, and she was supposed to be just another waitress finishing another long shift in a city that never cared who got tired, who got hurt, or who got forgotten. But Emily was not standing like someone who had nothing to hide. She kept one arm tucked close to her body, her fingers curled tight around a tray, and every time someone walked too near her, her shoulders flinched almost imperceptibly, as if pain had taught her to move before fear could even speak. Jack noticed the smallest details because noticing was how he survived. He had built his life by reading people before they opened their mouths, by sensing lies in a glance, danger in a pause, betrayal in silence. And now, in the middle of a perfectly polished dining room, he saw something that didn't belong. A dark mark just beneath Emily's sleeve, half covered, half hidden, like she had tried to make her own suffering invisible. He didn't call her out in front of the staff. He didn't make a scene. He simply watched as she placed a glass on the table with hands that were steady only because she had forced them to be. When Emily turned away, Jack caught another glimpse of the bruise near her wrist, and his jaw tightened. It wasn't just the injury that bothered him. It was the way she lowered her eyes, the way she moved as if she expected punishment for existing, the way she looked at the floor instead of the people around her. That was not the look of clumsiness. That was the look of someone who had been taught to stay quiet. Across the restaurant, a couple laughed too loudly. A waiter passed by with a silver tray, and the city beyond the windows kept shining as if nothing in the world was wrong. But Jack Morgan had already locked onto one truth. Emily Carter was hiding something, and whatever it was, it had left marks deeper than skin. He leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable, while inside, a storm began to build. Because men like Jack Morgan didn't ignore signs like that. They investigated them. And women like Emily Carter didn't carry bruises like those unless someone, somewhere, had made sure she learned how to suffer in silence. The night was supposed to be ordinary. Instead, it had just become the beginning of a story the entire city would soon be forced to hear. Jack Morgan didn't ask Emily Carter what happened the moment he saw the bruise. He already knew that questions asked too early could sound like accusations, and accusations made frightened people disappear behind lies. Instead, he waited until the dinner rush began to thin and the noise in the restaurant softened into a low murmur of clinking glasses and tired conversations. Emily moved from table to table with the careful precision of someone trying very hard not to draw attention, but Jack's eyes followed her every step. There was a stiffness in her right shoulder, a slight hesitation when she reached for anything above her waist, and once, just once, he saw her wince when a passing server brushed too close. That tiny reaction told him more than any confession could have. Emily was in pain, and she had been in pain long enough to hide it well. Jack set down his glass and signaled the manager without taking his eyes off her. The manager, a nervous man named Howard Ellis, came over with a smile that looked too practiced to be real. Howard treated Jack differently from everyone else in the room. He leaned in, lowered his voice, and asked if anything was wrong. Jack glanced toward Emily and asked a simple question. How long has she worked here? Howard blinked, as if surprised by the interest, then answered too quickly. A few months. Quiet girl. Keeps to herself. Jack studied him. Too quick. Too smooth. Men like Howard were always easy to read when they were afraid. Does she always look that tense? Jack asked. Howard's smile twitched. She's efficient. That's all. But Jack had spent enough years around the worst kind of men to recognize the structure of a cover-up. Efficient was what people said when they didn't want to say controlled. Quiet was what they said when they didn't want to say broken. Jack nodded once, then casually asked for the rest of the bill, but his mind had already moved on. The bruise, the flinch, the way Emily avoided every eye in the room. It all pointed to something darker than an accident. Something at work. Something personal. Something hidden. When Emily returned to his table with the check, Jack noticed her sleeve had slipped a little farther back. The bruise was worse than before, a deep, ugly shadow along her wrist and inner forearm. This time there was no doubt. Her fingers trembled as she placed the receipt in front of him. "You don't have to be afraid here," Jack said quietly, his voice low enough that only she could hear. Emily froze. For a second, her face changed, just a flicker, just enough to reveal panic beneath the politeness. She looked at him, then away, and whispered, "I'm fine." But the words were too fast, too practiced, too empty. Jack had heard those words from injured people before. They were never fine. They were surviving. And as Emily stepped back into the shadows of the restaurant floor, Jack made a decision without moving a muscle. He would find out who had done this to her. He would find out why she was hiding it. And if someone had made her feel like silence was the only way to stay alive, then that person had just made a very expensive mistake. Because once Jack Morgan noticed a wound, he never stopped until he found the hand that caused it. By the time the restaurant closed, Jack Morgan had already seen enough to know that Emily Carter's fear wasn't random. It had a pattern. The way she startled at sudden voices. The way she always stood near exits. The way her eyes drifted to the back hallway whenever a man in a dark coat passed by the front windows. Those were not the habits of a careless waitress. Those were the habits of someone who had learned to prepare for trouble before trouble arrived. Jack remained seated long after the other guests left, his thoughts sharpened into something colder than curiosity. He had built empires by noticing what other people missed, and tonight, the details were speaking louder than any confession. Emily wasn't just hiding bruises. She was hiding from someone. The restaurant manager, Howard Ellis, made the mistake of returning once the place was nearly empty, hoping to rush Jack out politely. Instead, Jack looked up and asked him one question that instantly drained the color from the man's face. "Who hurts her?" Howard's mouth opened, then shut again. The silence that followed was not the silence of ignorance. It was the silence of fear. Jack leaned back in his chair, folding one hand over the other, his expression calm enough to be dangerous. "I'm not asking twice," he said. Howard swallowed hard and glanced toward the kitchen entrance, as if expecting someone to appear and save him from the conversation. When no one came, he finally whispered that Emily had been having problems outside of work. Jack gave him a hard, unreadable stare. Problems with who? Howard hesitated. That hesitation was enough. Jack stood, and the weight of his presence seemed to compress the air around them. Howard immediately began talking faster, saying things he should have said from the start. A man had been waiting outside the restaurant after close. A man Emily seemed terrified of. A man who sometimes called the place and asked questions about her schedule. Jack's eyes narrowed. This was no longer about a bruise. It was surveillance, control, threats delivered in the dark. He turned toward the kitchen and saw Emily near the service door, her arms full of empty trays, her posture rigid as stone. Before Jack could call her over, another employee stepped between them and quietly warned her that he was outside again. Emily's face went pale. Jack saw the exact moment panic overtook her training. She lowered her eyes and said she needed to leave through the back, not because she wanted to, but because something had taught her that the front door was safer only in theory. That was the moment everything changed. Jack no longer saw a waitress with bruises. He saw a woman trapped inside a fear so practiced it had become part of her breathing. The city outside the restaurant was still glowing with traffic and neon and noise, but inside that small corridor, Jack understood the truth. Emily was being watched, and the person watching her believed no one powerful enough would ever care. That was the mistake. Jack cared now. And once he cared, the quiet little secrets surrounding Emily Carter were no longer going to survive the night. Jack Morgan didn't move for a few seconds after Emily Carter disappeared through the kitchen door. The restaurant was nearly empty now, but the silence felt heavier than when the room had been full. It was the kind of silence that meant something ugly had just been revealed, and no one in the room knew whether to run or stay. Jack stood slowly, his gaze fixed on the back hallway where Emily had vanished, and when he spoke, his voice was calm in the way storms are calm right before they break. "Bring me Howard Ellis," he said. The manager appeared almost instantly, wiping his hands on a towel that no longer looked clean enough to hide his nerves. Jack did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The pressure in his tone alone was enough to make Howard's knees stiffen. "She's afraid of someone," Jack said. Howard glanced away. That tiny motion was all Jack needed. "And you knew?" Howard's lips parted, then closed again. His face had gone gray around the edges. "Mr. Morgan, I don't know what you think you saw. I saw enough," Jack cut in. The words were quiet, but they landed like a blade. Howard took a shallow breath and looked toward the kitchen again, as if the answer might be standing there waiting to rescue him. When it didn't, he lowered his voice and admitted that Emily had been receiving calls for weeks. A man came to the restaurant after dark sometimes. He never entered through the front. He waited outside, near the alley. Sometimes Emily would see him and freeze. Sometimes she would disappear into the restroom for 10 minutes and come back looking as if she had been crying, though she never admitted it. Jack listened without blinking. Every sentence was a piece of a larger picture, and the picture was becoming worse by the second. Howard tried to explain that they had not wanted trouble, that Emily had insisted she could handle it, that he had not wanted to involve the police without proof. Jack's eyes hardened. You saw a woman being hunted, and your first thought was to protect the restaurant? Howard had no answer for that. Just then, the back door slammed open. Everyone in the room turned at once. A tall man in a dark jacket stood in the doorway, his expression sharp, his jaw set in a way that made the air feel colder. Emily was behind him, pale and terrified, one hand pressed to her side as though she had been caught in the act of surviving. Jack saw the man before anyone could speak. He was exactly the kind of person who believed fear was a language only the weak understood. He stepped forward slowly, his eyes locking onto Emily like she belonged to him. There you are, he said. The sound of his voice changed the atmosphere immediately. Emily flinched so hard that Jack knew he had found the source of her silence. Howard took an instinctive step back. Jack, however, did not move away. He moved closer. The stranger smiled like he had walked into a private arrangement, not a public place. Emily, he said again, and the way he said her name made Jack's stomach tighten. This was not a misunderstanding. This was not a family argument. This was ownership disguised as concern. And now Jack Morgan had seen the face behind the fear. The hidden pressure on Emily's life was no longer hidden. It had just walked through the door. The man in the dark jacket did not realize, at first, that the room had changed the moment he stepped inside. He stood there with the kind of confidence that comes from believing other people are too afraid to challenge you. His name was Derek Malloy, and he had clearly spent too much time mistaking intimidation for control. Emily Carter took one look at him and seemed to lose the last of her strength. Her shoulders pulled inward, her breathing turned shallow, and Jack Morgan saw, with perfect clarity, that the bruise on her wrist was not the worst thing Derek had given her. Fear had shaped her posture. Fear had timed her movements. Fear had taught her to stay quiet even when she wanted to run. Derek smiled at Emily, as if no one else existed in the room. I told you to answer your phone, he said, his tone low and irritated rather than loud. That was somehow worse. Loud men wanted to be heard. Quiet men wanted to be obeyed. Emily said nothing. She couldn't. Jack stepped forward before Derek could close the distance any further. She doesn't look like she wants to speak to you, Jack said evenly. Derek finally noticed him, and the smile on his face shifted into something more careful. He looked Jack up and down, recognizing power when it stood in front of him, but not yet understanding how much of it he was standing in. This doesn't concern you, Derek replied. Jack's expression didn't change. It does now. The words were simple, but they settled into the room with enough force to make the staff stop moving. Howard Ellis, who had been hovering near the counter with the face of a man praying for invisibility, suddenly looked as though he might faint. Derek gave a short laugh, as if amused by the idea that anyone would dare interrupt him. He turned back to Emily and took one step toward her. That was enough. Jack moved again, faster this time, and placed himself directly between them. You're done, Jack said. Derek's eyes narrowed. You have no idea what you're talking about. I know exactly what I'm talking about, Jack answered. I know when a man comes into a woman's workplace to scare her instead of speak to her. I know when a bruise says more than words. I know when someone thinks silence means permission. The room went still. Emily's gaze lifted for the first time, though she still looked as if she expected to be punished for it. Derek's jaw tightened. You've got this all wrong. Do I? Jack asked. Then he turned slightly, just enough for Emily to see his face. His voice softened, but only for her. You don't have to go with him. Those 7 words seemed to break something open in her. Emily's eyes filled, but she refused to cry. Instead, she held her breath and shook her head once, barely. Jack saw the answer in that motion more clearly than if she had shouted it. She was terrified. Derek noticed too, and the irritation on his face sharpened into anger. "Emily," he said, firmer. "Now." But Jack had already made up his mind. He reached for his phone with one hand, while keeping the other between Derek and Emily. "From this point on," he said, "you're not speaking to her, touching her, or following her anywhere again." Derek gave him a contemptuous stare. "And who exactly is going to stop me?" Jack looked him dead in the eye and answered with calm certainty, "I am." For a second, nobody in the restaurant moved. Derek Malloy stood frozen with an expression that flickered between disbelief and rage, as if he had never imagined that someone would dare stand in his way. Emily Carter remained behind Jack Morgan, one hand pressed against the edge of a table for support, her face pale enough to look almost drained of color. But Jack was no longer watching Derek's pride. He was watching Emily's reaction, because the truth had become painfully obvious. This was not a random confrontation. This was a pattern she had survived too many times already. Jack lifted his phone, not as a threat, but as a decision already made. Derek noticed it instantly. "Put that away," he snapped. Jack didn't even blink. No, the single word landed like a lock clicking shut. Derek took a half step forward, but when Jack's gaze sharpened, he stopped. It wasn't fear of violence that checked him. It was something worse. Recognition. Men like Derek always understood when they had finally met someone who would not be intimidated. Howard Ellis, nearly hidden behind the bar, looked as though he wanted to vanish into the floor. Jack called his chief of security first, then a lawyer, then someone whose name made Howard's mouth fall open when he heard it. Jack spoke in short, controlled sentences, each one adding another layer of pressure around Derek's crumbling confidence. He asked for surveillance footage from the restaurant's side entrance. He asked for the call logs. He asked for the last 3 weeks of schedules and for every employee who had seen Emily leave after closing. Howard tried to object, but Jack cut him off before the man could finish. "If there's a record of her being followed, I want it. If someone's been waiting outside, I want that too." Emily stared at him, confused by the speed and force of his response. She had expected sympathy, maybe even concern, but not this. Not immediate action. Not a man with enough power to make the room itself feel accountable. Derek, realizing the tide had turned, tried to reclaim control. "You think this changes anything?" he asked, his voice sharp with resentment. Jack glanced at him once and then looked back at Emily. "It already has." Then he moved toward the security camera mounted above the dining room and pointed at it. "Make sure that footage doesn't disappear," he told Howard. "If anything goes missing, I'll know." Howard nodded so quickly it was almost a bow. Emily's breathing became uneven. Jack saw her struggling to process that someone was actually taking her side without asking her to earn it. That was the moment the story began to shift from suspicion to exposure. Jack was no longer just a witness. He was a threat to the secret Derek had relied on. And as the manager hurried to comply, Jack turned slightly and asked Emily one question, his voice lowered to something steadier than comfort and stronger than pity. "How long has he been doing this to you?" Emily looked at him for a long moment, her lips parting and closing again. The answer was written all over her face before she spoke. "Too long. Far too long." Jack's jaw tightened with a kind of anger he did not show often. There it was, the bruise, the fear, the silence, the control. The evidence was no longer hidden in gestures or glances. It was in the room now, breathing with them. And Jack Morgan had just begun to uncover the full shape of the truth. Emily Carter took one breath, then another, but the third one came out shaky, like her body had forgotten how to trust air. Jack Morgan stayed where he was, close enough to block Derek Malloy, but not so close that Emily would feel trapped. He had learned long ago that people in fear needed space more than they needed speeches. Derek, meanwhile, was still trying to recover his dignity, though the room no longer belonged to him. The security camera above the dining area blinked quietly, recording everything. Howard Ellis had already backed toward the office with Jack's lawyers on the line, and the staff stood in stunned silence as if they had just realized the evening had turned into something much larger than a private argument. Emily's fingers twisted at the edge of her apron. Jack could see her fighting against instinct, fighting the urge to protect the same man who had clearly been destroying her peace for months. That, too, told him something important. Abuse did not always leave its victims angry. Sometimes it left them trained. Derek let out a bitter laugh. "She's overreacting," he said, as though volume could turn cruelty into reason. "This is a misunderstanding." Emily flinched at his voice. That tiny movement revealed more than 1,000 words ever could. Jack noticed it immediately, and so did everyone else in the room. The ugly truth had begun to surface. Derek had not simply frightened Emily once or twice. He had built a system around her fear. The calls, the waiting outside, the visits after closing, the bruises hidden beneath sleeves. None of it was random. It was control disguised as concern. And now that the first layer was gone, the shape of the deeper wound was becoming visible. Emily finally looked at Jack, and there was something in her eyes that had not been there before. Not safety yet. Not exactly. But the beginning of belief. "He knows where I live," she whispered, almost too softly to hear. The words froze the room. Jack's expression hardened. "And he's been there tonight." Emily nodded once, barely. "He said if I told anyone, no one would believe me." Derek's face changed at that moment. The self-assurance slipped, and in its place came irritation sharpened by panic. He took a step toward her, but Jack cut him off instantly, his arm lifting between them like a wall. "Don't move," Jack said. Derek stopped, glaring. "You think you can just rewrite what's happening here because you've got money?" Jack didn't bother answering the insult. Instead, he turned his head slightly and asked Emily, "Has he hurt you before?" Emily's eyes shut for a second, and when they opened again, the truth was there, fully unmasked. "Yes," she said. Not loud, not dramatic, just honest. The word landed harder than any shout could have. The room didn't react at first, but Jack saw the shift in every face, the realization spreading in slow, stunned waves. This was no misunderstanding. This was not a jealous ex or a bad argument. This was a woman being trapped, watched, and threatened into silence. And worse, she had learned to carry the shame of it like it belonged to her. Jack's jaw tightened, and the anger inside him became something colder, more focused. He had found the core of the story now, the part that made all the earlier signs make sense. Emily was not hiding bruises because she was embarrassed. She was hiding them because she had been taught that exposing them would make everything worse. That was the true horror beneath the surface. And as Derek stood there, cornered by the truth he could no longer control, Jack understood that the next move would not just expose him. It would destroy the lie he had used to keep Emily silent. Jack Morgan did not waste another second. The moment Emily Carter admitted the truth, something in him went cold and precise, the way it always did when a line had been crossed too many times. He stepped away from Derek Malloy only long enough to give a final instruction into his phone. "Send the team. Now. And pull every record tied to this man before he has a chance to run." His voice was low, controlled, and absolute. Derek heard enough to understand that the ground under him was starting to crack. "You can't do this," he said. But the words sounded weaker now, stripped of the arrogance he had entered with. Jack turned to him slowly. "You've been standing in front of a frightened woman and calling it concern. You've been showing up outside her home, outside her work, and trying to make fear feel normal. That ends tonight." Derek's face tightened. He looked around the room, expecting someone, Howard, an employee, anyone, to rescue him from the consequences he had spent months avoiding. No one moved. The restaurant had become a courtroom without a judge, and every witness was finally awake. Emily remained behind Jack, trembling, but something had changed in her posture. The tension in her shoulders had not disappeared, yet for the first time all night she was no longer shrinking. She was watching the man who had haunted her life begin to lose control. That alone was enough to make her exhale in a way that sounded almost like release. Jack's security arrived within minutes, moving with practiced efficiency. One guard positioned himself near the back door, another took the front, and a third moved to prevent Derek from approaching Emily again. Derek protested, then argued, then threatened. Each new sentence sounded more desperate than the last. When he tried to step toward Emily, 2 security men stopped him immediately. Jack did not look surprised. He looked done. "You're finished here," he said. Derek scoffed, but it lacked conviction. "This isn't over. For you it is," Jack answered without hesitation. At the same time, one of Jack's lawyers entered the restaurant with a folder already open, as if the situation had been anticipated long before Derek understood how badly he had miscalculated. The lawyer asked for names, dates, and every detail Emily could remember. Emily hesitated only a moment before speaking, and once she began, The truth came out in broken but steady pieces. The calls after midnight, the waiting by her apartment building, the messages left when she didn't answer, the time he grabbed her wrist hard enough to leave a mark, the warnings that no one would believe her if she complained. Each detail landed in the room like another piece of evidence. Howard Ellis stared at the floor, ashamed now for every moment he had chosen silence over action. Jack listened without interrupting, his expression hardening with every word. This was worse than he had first thought. This was not just intimidation. This was a deliberate campaign of control. The kind of cruelty that feeds on isolation and survives because people mistake fear for privacy. Emily's voice trembled, but she kept going. And as she spoke, the city outside continued to glow and move and hum, unaware that inside one small restaurant, the lie around her had started to collapse. Jack stood beside her like a wall she had never been given before, and when her final sentence fell into the silence, "I thought I was alone," he answered with a certainty that changed everything. Not anymore. By the next morning, the city was already talking. Not because Jack Morgan wanted attention, and not because Emily Carter had sought it, but because truth has a way of spreading once someone powerful refuses to let it be buried. News of Derek Malloy's arrest moved quickly through the neighborhoods, the restaurant district, and the offices where people liked to pretend they never saw the signs. The footage from the side entrance, the phone logs, the witness statements, and Emily's own testimony painted a picture too clear to deny. Derek had been stalking her for months, threatening her into silence, and using fear like a leash. By the time investigators finished reviewing the evidence, the story had become impossible to twist. Howard Ellis, shaken and ashamed, admitted that he had ignored too many warning signs because he was afraid of disruption. Jack did not reward excuses. He made it clear that silence had helped the abuse survive, and silence would not be allowed anywhere near his name again. Emily, though exhausted, was no longer alone in the way she had been before. She met with Jack one final time in a quiet office overlooking the city, where the windows reflected the morning light like a promise that had finally come true. She looked smaller than the night before, but also stronger, as if some invisible weight had been lifted from her shoulders the moment she no longer had to carry the fear by herself. "You didn't have to do all this," she said softly. Jack looked at her for a long moment before answering. "Yes, I did." It was not said with arrogance. It was said like someone speaking a simple truth. Emily lowered her eyes, then gave the faintest nod. For the first time, there was no panic there, only relief. Outside, the city kept moving, but inside those walls, something had changed permanently. Derek was no longer waiting in shadows. The calls were over. The threats had ended. The lie he had used to control Emily had been dragged into the light and shattered. And because Jack Morgan had refused to look away, the woman who had once hidden bruises beneath her sleeve was finally free to breathe without fear. The story did not end with a dramatic celebration or a perfect smile. It ended with justice beginning its work, one consequence at a time, while Emily stood in the morning light and understood that survival was no longer the same thing as silence. Jack watched her leave the office with a steadier step than she had arrived with, and he knew the city would remember this case for a long time. Not because of scandal, not because of power, but because one man had seen a wound, followed it to the truth, and changed the ending for someone who had been told she did not matter. By the time the sun climbed higher, everyone in the city understood the same thing. When Jack Morgan noticed something wrong, he did not ignore it. He burned through it until what was hidden could no longer hurt anyone again.